Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in this world. This is John West, back to you once again with Japanese business and economy. Yes, John West back again with Japanese business and economy. We're here for class 11A, the first half of class 11. And in this class, we're going to be looking at the relationship between the US, the United States of America, and Japan. I've called this lecture From Trumponomics to Bidenomics. Now, very few world leaders worry more about the US presidential elections than the Japanese leaders. So Tokyo followed very closely Joe Biden's victory over Donald Trump in November 2020. The reason is that the two countries' history and relationship are long and deep. Following Japan's defeat in World War II, the US remade Japan into a very close Cold War ally. The US helped finance Japan's post-war reconstruction. It made Japan into a democracy. Japan and the US were key allies in the battle against communism. The US offered its open market for Japan's export-led development. And Japan depends on the US for its security through a military alliance. Japan still hosts some 50,000 US troops on its soil. Now, ever since World War II, Japan's foreign policy has been substantially made in Washington. You can see here in the photo, Ronald Reagan and Yasu Nakasone, two great friends. But tensions between the US and Japan entered into the relationship in the 1970s and 1980s, when Japan was rising in power and when Japan seemed to challenge the US, and also when Japan was running large trade surpluses. While Japan did little to open its market, it buckled to US pressure to revalue the yen and made large investments in the US. Now, when Japan fell into a financial crisis during the 1990s, America's Japan threat faded. With the end of the Cold War, the US called on Japan to be more active in its foreign policy. And it has indeed become more active and independent in its foreign policy while sticking close to the US. During the Obama presidency, the US and Japan were the closest of allies in light of China's growing threat and, of course, the North Korean threat. Now, although Japan feels more comfortable with a Republican president than a Democrat, the election of Donald Trump was a great shock to Japan. Trump was critical of Japan during the 2016 election campaign. He complained that Japan did not pay enough for the military alliance. Japan spends just 1% of GDP on military, whereas the US spends 3.5%. Trump suggested that Japan could even get nuclear weapons, something which would be frightening for Korea and China. And Trump criticized the US trade deficit with Japan and many other things. Now, after President Obama pushed Japan to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, Trump withdrew the US from the TPP. Japan saw this as a betrayal. After that, Trump pushed Japan for a bilateral free trade agreement to gain more access to the Japanese agricultural market. US farmers were losing out to TPP countries, which now had better access to the Japanese market. Japan was also worried about Trump's discussions with North Korea. You remember that Trump met with Kim Jong-un a couple of times. He was worried that Japan was worried that Trump might do a deal with North Korea without consulting Japan, leaving Japan exposed. Listen, watch this very interesting video about North Korea firing missiles over Japanese airspace.
Breaking new details about North Korea's missile launch. Kim Jong-un's regime firing what's believed to be an intermediate range ballistic missile over Japanese airspace for the second time in a month. Now an emergency UN meeting has been called, and our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, has all the latest developments from DC. Good morning, Martha.
Good morning, Amy. It is clear this morning that neither condemnation, threats of force, or sanctions are stopping Kim Jong-un in his quest to perfect a nuclear missile program. Alarms blaring in Japan as North Korea launched yet another missile over Japanese territory for the second time in a month. Another extreme provocation by North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. The intermediate range ballistic missile launched from the North Korean capital of Pyongyang, passing over Japan just 10 minutes later, landing over 1,200 miles off the coast of the Japanese island of Hokkaido, traveling a total distance of 2,300 miles. American tourist Matt Galat, staying in Hokkaido, was awoken by the deafening sirens.
Find shelter in a basement. North Korea just launched a missile.
South Korean military responding immediately, launching its own missile 150 miles into the Sea of Japan, a precise show of force meant to warn Kim Jong-un that South Korea can target him directly. Secretary of Defense James Mattis saying the launch put millions of Japanese in duck and cover, and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson calling on China and Russia to take direct actions of their own. This is the 14th time North Korea has launched ballistic missiles this year, the 5th since the start of July. On Thursday, President Trump tried to reassure Americans in the face of the North Korean threat, saying he is working with China.
We have a very good relationship with China and with the president of China. But believe me, the people of this country will be very, very safe.
But it is unclear what will stop this cycle of provocation and threat. This latest launch comes just 3 days after new sanctions and less than 2 weeks after North Korea tested what is likely a hydrogen bomb that the country says could be placed on an intercontinental ballistic missile. Amy?
All right, Martha Raddatz, thank you. Let's bring in our military analyst, Colonel Steve Ganyard. And Steve, let's talk about the why. Why North Korea?
Yeah, so there you are. That film's a few years old now, but it highlights to us all Japan's worries, Japan's concerns about North Korea. Japan is in a very, very vulnerable situation vis-a-vis North Korea, and of course is very worried that when American leaders talk with North Korea, that American leaders might do a deal with North Korea and forget the concerns of Japan. Now, there's another concern that our Japanese friends have about North Korea. That is the case of Japanese citizens who were abducted by North Korean spies in the 1970s and 1980s.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Access Asia. Coming up, rockets and nuclear bombs steal the headlines, but for the Japanese, the threat from North Korea also includes kidnappings, top issue as leaders Donald Trump and Shinzo Abe met in Japan. Indian farmers are up to their necks with the local government's land grab. After weeks of protest, we'll find out if they were successful or not. And going under the knife, China sees a surge in plastic surgery as people look to fight off old age, woo a mate, or even find a job. But first, Donald Trump made his first visit to Japan as US president and met Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The top talking point was a rising threat from North Korea. But that threat, at least for Japan, is beyond the rockets, missiles, and nuclear bombs. The two leaders also discussing the decades-old issue of Japanese citizens being abducted by North Korean agents. Gainsford reports.
Megumi Yokata was only 13 years old when she disappeared in 1977. On her way back from school, she was seized by agents sent by Pyongyang, bundled into a boat, and taken to North Korea.
I can never forgive North Korea. They kidnapped a 13-year-old girl and caused her family so much sadness. all for their own benefits.
It's not known what became of Megumi, and there are hundreds of other similar cases. North Korea denied the kidnappings up until 2002, when the then Japanese Prime Minister met with leader Kim Jong-il in Pyongyang. After the visit, Pyongyang finally admitted to 17 kidnappings, 12 of whom died. 5 were released back to Japan. The abductions peaked in the 1970s and 80s. In the aftermath of the Second Korean War, Kim Il-sung was looking for revenge. He planned to infiltrate South Korea using spies, passing as Japanese citizens. Kidnapped Japanese nationals were used to train these operatives. The plight of the abductees is a key issue for Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who's pledged to rescue them while in office.
Unless North Korea resolves the abductions, nuclear and missile issues, they will not have a bright future.
The 5 repatriated Japanese citizens revealed that they've been used as language tutors at a North Korean spy academy, but it's still not clear what happened to the hundreds of other missing persons. 40 years on, the mystery remains unsolved.
Well, North Korea is a hot and sensitive topic in Japan, especially after Pyongyang's fired several.
So there you have it, another issue that was of great concern for our Japanese friends when it comes to North Korea, the issue of Japanese citizens abducted by North Korean spies, an unresolved issue. Now, when Donald Trump was president of the US, Japan spent a lot of time trying to stay friends with the US. Trump, of course, was a very volatile, inconsistent sort of a character, a very difficult person to stay friends with. But Japan, under Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister at the time, actually did a pretty good job staying friends with Mr. Trump. At the same time, because Japan and Australia and other countries are worried about the reliability of the US, Japan also worked to strengthen the friendships with other countries like India, like Australia, and like Southeast Asia. And under Abe, Japan also promoted the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This, of course, is an idea which is the opposite of the Chinese idea of the future of the Asia-Pacific region. Now, Japan also, after the US pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal under President Trump, Japan led a successful renegotiation of the TPP with the remaining members. And as we discussed in an earlier lecture, the now called TPP has entered into force as a trade agreement. Japan is also a member of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, another trade deal with Southeast Asia, which recently entered into force. And so, because of the absence of Japan, of the US, the withdrawal of the US from trade diplomacy in East Asia, Japan has taken on a leadership role. At the same time, Japan was actually relieved by Trump's tough position on China. They thought that, our Japanese friends thought that Obama did not take the challenge of Beijing seriously enough. Now, the Japanese Prime Minister who followed Prime Minister Abe, Mr. Suga, he spoke by telephone to US President-elect Biden immediately after the election. He secured the reassurance that the two countries' military alliance remains strong, that it remains the cornerstone of the American strategy in Asia. And this included a pledge by President Biden that his administration will commit to protecting the Japanese-administered Senkaku Islands under the Security Alliance. This is a very important point from a Japanese point of view. Now, Japan has been happy that Biden has continued Donald Trump's tough line against China. Biden has also, at the same time, had a more cooperative attitude towards allies and partners, particularly towards Japan. Biden is putting like-minded democratic allies at the heart of his foreign policy, notably through the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which involves US, Japan, India, and Australia. And Biden has also entered into an agreement with UK and Australia called AUKUS. And of course, Japan is very happy about that. And so overall, Japan is very happy with Biden's approach to the Indo-Pacific area, its approach to China, and its approach to working with allies in the Indo-Pacific region. At the same time, Japan is worried about the US because the US now has many domestic problems. The problems of managing COVID-19, and of course, the problems of managing a broken society. And of course, this means that President Biden has less time than otherwise for worrying about foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific. Now, Japan was hoping that President Biden might rejoin the TPP, or what we now call the CPTPP. That is unlikely to happen. President Biden has said that the US will not enter into new trade agreements until it invests enough in domestic workers and education. So as I alluded to earlier, the US is now absent from Asia's free trade agreements, and is spending much more time addressing America's COVID-19 disaster, as well as its broken society. Now, with the Biden administration limited in its capacity for global leadership over the next couple of years, China will have a strategic opportunity to strengthen its position. We've seen that through the COVID times, that China has been taking advantage of developments in the international scene to become more assertive and to play a bigger role. In short, while Biden's approach to Asia has been more constructive, he may not be much more effective for some time, and Japan will remain worried and vulnerable. So, repeating what I said a bit earlier, Japan will continue to work closely with like-minded powers like Australia, India, and Southeast Asia. So that's a brief overview of the very critical relationship between Japan and the US. And of course, it's the heart of this issue is the passage from Trumponomics to Bidenomics. So thank you once again for sharing this moment with me. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you about this important issue. And if you have any comments, questions, please send me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to talking with you in our next student discussion session. Bye for now. Sayonara.